transition of King Henry VIII from an athletic, vivacious prince into a corpulent, rotting sovereign is one of the most grotesque chapters in British history. By the time of his death on the 28th of January 1547, the 55-year-old king was a physical wreck. His physical dissolution not only shocked his court, but also initiated a legacy of gruesome folklore and persistent paranormal reports. The subsequent sightings of his ghost, alongside those of his wives and successors across the palaces of Whitehall, Hampton Court, and Windsor Castle, represent a deep intersection of historical trauma, political manipulation, and environmental anomalies. We have taken our research deeper to explore Henry VIII's agonizing end, the horrific events of his funeral transit, and the comprehensive chronicle of supernatural encounters reported in his former royal homes. During his final years, Henry VIII's physical state was a visible symbol of decay. His weight had ballooned to approximately 400 pounds, his waist measurement expanded to 54 inches, and his body was covered in pus-filled boils. Leg injuries sustained during a 1536 jousting tournament had degenerated into open, festering osteomyelitis ulcers. These leg wounds regularly became blocked, releasing a putrid stench so intense that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs over their noses. The odour was so powerful that individuals could track the king's movements through the palace corridors simply by following the trail of the smell. By late January 1547, the king lay on his deathbed at the Palace of Whitehall, suffering from systemic organ failure, likely exacerbated by severe renal insufficiency. When Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer was summoned in the early hours of Friday, the 28th of January, the king was beyond speech. The archbishop implored him to give a sign that he trusted in Christ, and Henry tightened his grip on the archbishop's hand before slipping away at approximately 2 a.m. What happened in the hours that followed would plant the seeds of centuries of horror. Guards posted outside the king's chambers swore they heard movement within, dragging footsteps, laboured breathing, the thump of a walking stick against the floor. One guard, driven to the edge of sanity by what he'd heard, abandoned his post and fled into the night, never to return to royal service again. Because of the political instability surrounding the succession of his 9-year-old son, Prince Edward, the king's death was kept strictly secret for nearly 3 days. Under the direction of the king's brother-in-law, Edward Seymour, royal meals continued to be brought into the king's private chambers to maintain the pretense that the monarch was still alive. It was not until the morning of Monday, the 31st of January, that the tearful Lord Chancellor, Sir Thomas Wriothesley, formally announced the king's passing to Parliament. This 3-day delay had disastrous biological consequences. Although court embalmers eventually set to work, stuffing the cavity with sawdust, resin, and aromatic herbs, and wrapping the body before placing it in a heavy wooden coffin, advanced internal decomposition had already taken root. As they worked on the body, it said that air escaped from the king's lungs, creating sounds so similar to human speech that one embalmer fainted. On February the 14th, 1547, the massive funeral cortege departed Whitehall for Windsor Castle. The procession was a staggering display of Tudor statecraft, stretching over 4 miles, and containing more than 1,000 mourners on horseback, alongside hundreds on foot. The immense lead-lined coffin, which weighed over half a ton, was transported on a grand, multi-wheeled carriage styled as a chariot draped in black velvet, and a life-sized wax effigy placed on top of the king, wearing a real crown. The cortege stopped overnight at Sion House, formerly Sion Abbey, in Brentford, West London. This location carried profound historical irony. Sion Abbey, a prestigious house of Brigittine nuns, had been brutally dissolved by Henry VIII during the Reformation, and it had served as a prison for his doomed 5th wife, Catherine Howard, prior to her execution in February 1542. The coffin was placed in the ruined Abbey chapel, where it was left unattended overnight. During the night, the combined forces of decomposition and stress took a macabre toll. The continuous jarring of the heavy carriage over Tudor roads had weakened the solder joints of the coffin. At the same time, the delay in embalming had allowed an immense build-up of highly pressurized gases inside the sealed lead container. These internal gases cause the lead plates to explode with a sudden release of pressure, forcing highly corrupt, dark, and foul-smelling decomposition fluids to seep through the split seams and pool on the stone floor of the desecrated chapel. In 1842, the Victorian biographer Agnes Strickland expanded upon this narrative, quoting a purported 16th century manuscript from the Sloane collection. The king, being carried to Windsor to be buried, stood all night among the broken walls of Sion, and there the leaden coffin being cleft by the shaking of the carriage, the pavement of the church was wetted with his blood. In the morning came plumbers to solder the coffin, under whose feet, trembling while I write it, was suddenly seen a dog creeping and licking up the king's blood. If you ask me how I know this, I answer, William Greville, who could scarcely drive away the dog, told me, and so did the plumber also. This incident was viewed as the literal fulfillment of a terrifying prophecy. In the early 1530s, a Franciscan friar named William Peto, later elevated to cardinal, had preached a fiery sermon before the king at Greenwich. Peto had compared Henry to the wicked biblical king Ahab, predicting that if he went down his path of spiritual rebellion, the dogs should lick his blood. William Greville, an esquire of the body to Henry VIII, who was active in local administration and attended the royal funeral, confirmed the incident alongside the plumber who had been brought in to resolder the ruptured lead plates. The physical reality of this coffin failure received striking confirmation centuries later. Windsor Castle is widely cited as the most haunted of all British royal residences, with more than 25 documented spiritual encounters spanning several centuries. I have a video on Windsor Castle's 25 ghosts on the channel. I will link it in the description and at the end of this video. Among these is the restless spirit of King Henry VIII. Unlike many passive apparitions, Henry's ghost is highly auditory and characterized by raw emotion. Witnesses, including castle staff, guards, and visitors, frequently report hearing the heavy, uneven, dragging sound of a massive man hobbling through the deanery cloisters. This hobbling is directly linked to the excruciating pain of the leg ulcers that dominated his final years. The apparition is described by those who have seen it as a massive, broad-shouldered figure pacing furiously through the corridors, occasionally shouting commands and groaning in deep agony. A striking modern account was reported by a former long-term employee of the Royal Library. A colleague of the librarian, working late one night in a deserted hall near the library, heard the distinct sound of a man groaning loudly, shouting and dragging a heavy leg. Upon checking the corridor, she found it empty. On a subsequent night, she heard the exact same pattern of dragging steps and groans. Remaining still in her office, she watched a large, solid-looking figure pass by her open doorway. Shaken, she noted that the apparition looked incredibly lifelike, closely resembling the actor Keith Michelle in his famous 1970s television portrayal of the king. In 1813, during the construction of a passage to a new royal vault in St. George's Chapel, workmen broke into the Tudor vault containing the remains of Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, and Charles I. The exhumation party, which included the Prince Regent, later George IV, and the royal physician, Sir Henry Harford, noted that while Jane Seymour's coffin was intact, Henry's outer wooden coffin was completely shattered and fragmented. Crucially, the inner lead coffin appeared beaten in with violence about the middle, exposing his skeletonized remains. This severe midsection structural deformation strongly indicates either a gas-driven rupture that occurred during his transit in 1547, or a violent structural collapse caused by the buildup of highly pressurized gases inside the vault after his entombment. Hampton Court, gifted to Henry VIII by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in 1528, is the undisputed epicenter of Tudor paranormal phenomena. I have a video on the channel about the hauntings of Hampton Court Palace. I will link this video in the description. The turbulent years of the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, and the execution of Charles I created a unique literary and cultural phenomenon in England, the ghostly playlet. The trauma of regicide and the death of over 200,000 citizens in the conflict left the national psyche deeply scarred. Writers and pamphleteers co-opted the spirits of deceased monarchs as powerful political symbols, writing fictional dialogues where ghosts returned from the grave to comment on the state of the nation. The most famous of these pamphlets was printed in France in 1657 and circulated in England in 1658. It detailed a terrifying supernatural occurrence that allegedly took place in February 1649, during the burial of Charles I's decapitated body in Henry VIII's vault at Windsor. According to the pamphlet, as the heavy black pall was laid over Charles's coffin, those present in the crypt were startled by a horrid sound emerging directly from Henry's tomb. The voice of the long-dead Tudor king, described as complaining with a loud and horridly frightful noise, bellowed from the stone floor. "Ho! Who is this, with sacrilegious impiety, that dares vex the so long quiet ashes of a king so many years since deceased?" To this, the ghost of the newly executed Charles I responded in an extremely doleful tone, explaining his tragic fate. The pamphlet's author claimed that the local military authorities had immediately suppressed the story, throwing witnesses into prison and bribing the soldiers present into silence. The horrific details of Henry VIII's physical decline, the rupture of his coffin at Sion Abbey, and the extensive history of ghost sightings across England's royal palaces reveal a connection between historical trauma and cultural memory. The biological reality of his death, accelerated by obesity, systemic infection, and the political secrecy that delayed his embalming, created the conditions for the gruesome scene at Sion Abbey. This event, interpreted by contemporaries as divine retribution, laid the groundwork for the king's reputation as a restless, tormented spirit.